Hey, what's up, guys? How's it going? So, on the topic of basically being like, I don't know, I think for a while, people have always kind of wondered, like, how do people get to be 5, 6, 7, 800 million but still simultaneously be able to, play the game? How do you do that? How do you build up? Now, here's the advice that I have to give for those of you out there that are trying to be a rally leader, or that you're trying to be, you want to be somebody that is able, to conquer your enemies, be able to do as much as you can possibly do, and then eventually that one day be the 700 mil, 800 mil, whatever it be, kind of player. So let's get into it, right? So there are a couple of things that you might have noticed in the past, I don't know, couple of weeks. This is currently the going strategy that I'm going with that works quite well. Now, as you can tell, I have an enormous amount of gems. Part of this is to do with the fact that you got to save. Step number one for this is, generally speaking, you want to basically put as much time as you possibly can into the trove researches and start saving your gems. And that means you need to be going into the Coliseum. You need to get into the top 100, preferably anywhere from the top 20 to top 30. If you can stay in that ballpark, you're going to be just fine. And what I do, right, is I'm not carrying a ton of troops on me. Part of the reason why is because you really don't need that many. So I've got about 30K and then about 10K destroyers. And then I've got about anywhere from 60 to 80K. And tier 3s, and then the rest I have like 70K archers. Now, part of the reason why I'm currently going with this build is that you can basically rally anybody with this. And part of the reason why you can is because really, when you're a rally lead, you don't necessarily need to have how do you say, a lot of the time people assume that some of the best rally leads out there are completely maxed out, have tons of tier 4s, and can put as much as they possibly want into a rally. And that really doesn't mean anything, because at the end of the day, all right, there's a mentality that goes for rally leading, and part of the mentality is stats. So let's begin, right? One of the few things that you have to consider when you actually look at a rally target is whether or not they have their leader out. Okay, in the case of forts, especially, one thing you definitely want to pay attention to is not only just the gear that they're wearing, but also what is the troop composition. Because again, like I've been saying, both the gear and the troop composition is going to have a pretty large impact in how you're going to end up panning out. Now, luckily, for those of you who have a majority tier 4 guild, it's going to come to your advantage to have a lot of tier 4s, but it doesn't necessarily mean you need to. Because I probably would have had the same exact results. I mean, had I had even 100,000 less of these. But the mindset is pretty simple. Is the person in war gear? If not, attack. Because odds are you're probably going to get them. Now, one thing to be considerate of, though, is also their troop composition. So in this case, I looked at the troop composition and I said to myself, what does this person have most of? What does this person have the least of? So I could tell that, this person had a ton of range. I mean, generally speaking, you can just look at it and say, okay, there's a lot of range in this. But I also noticed that there's 274,000 cavalry and 139,000 drakes. And so for that reason, I said, okay, give me range to counter the cavalry, because that's going to be my primary problem. Because that's going to be more than likely one of the main issues that I'm going to have, is to have to get through the cavalry. Now, yes, there is 240,000 guards, but there's only 50,000 fighters. And that means I really don't need as many cavalry, so I didn't really ask for it. I got some drakes, but the drakes were just so that, if I needed to, I could just clear out the fighters. And then obviously having just even 100,000 drakes is more than enough to kill all of those guards. And then the rest is all basically fighters, which is 300K. And of course, I did ask for a little bit of guards just to cover those, but I really didn't need that much. And that basically clears out all of those heroic cannoneers. And again, I didn't get them all. but I was able to clear most of them. Now, I think had I done this again, I probably should have asked for about 200,000 less cannoneers and about 5 to 700,000 fighters instead. But granted, you never know what you're going to go up against. And so, you know, part of the mindset with when you actually go after forts, or if you go after rally targets, is you need to know their troop composition. So as a rally lead, one of the few things that you definitely need to be considerate of is what does your opponent have in his base. And if you can figure out what unit type it is that you need to counter with, the next thing you need to consider is also what phalanx am I going to use. So if, let's suppose, you want to be an infantry cav player, you would think that you should go either infantry phalanx or cav phalanx. But one thing to consider is also the positioning of those unit types. So if you go cav phalanx, you're going to have cav and then infantry in the very far back. If you have range phalanx, you're going to have infantry in the front and then cav almost immediately behind it. And if you don't have any range, then the range aren't going to appear. If you go infantry phalanx, then obviously you're going to have basically the same thing that you would have had with the range phalanx, it's just in reverse. Now you have the infantry in the front, which, you know, again, in 2-on-2 on one side in the range phalanx, or a 2-on-2 of cav. Now again, the result is fairly similar, but it's, quite frankly, it's really not necessarily the same. Now, why do I say that? Well, because part of the reason why, you know, and this is something that I thought was really, really helpful, that I was browsing Wii Gamers just like anybody else, right? And one of the neat features of like using these phalanxes is that you actually need to know what is it exactly that makes certain phalanxes work the way they do. Like what wedges are better used for certain practical, you know, like practical uses, right? You know, like what should I be using it for? What's a good way or a good example of, like, you know, when I should probably use, you know, something or not. And again, I'll go ahead and I will have a link, like I'll show you here in a second. Anyway, so now you know what it looks like. But essentially, you know, if by taking a glance at that, you can kind of get an idea of like what you can use in certain circumstances. Now, obviously, you know, if you're going to be a rally lead, all right, it is key that you have players. And oftentimes when people actually go out and they go decide to, you know, be a rally lead, a lot of the time, most of the best rally leads are going to be in full gold champ gear. But most of the time, even a, you know, free-to-play or mild pay-to-play player can in some ways be able to do this, and it really doesn't require a whole lot. All that you need to know is that essentially, all right, you want to go into your army stats, and you want to go up into here, and essentially, you want to determine whether or not the person that you're going to attack is online. If they're not online, that makes them an open target. If they are not online, then you've got the best chance. Now, obviously, you want to be able to keep record of this. So you need to know what time is this person offline. How long are they offline? Are they going to be back on in an hour? How often does their guild react if you, say, rally them? And again, these are things that you can test just by setting a one troop on somebody random in their guild and just see how long does it take for them to take the rally seriously. You know, even have somebody in your guild, one troop, and send reinforcements just to see how long it would possibly take them at that hour of the day to react. And when you get a repetition of this, you'll eventually figure out whether or not they're capable of something. Step 2 in this is to figure out both, you know, what the troop composition is. That means you need to have a scout. And there's a lot that can be said in a scout. And I think you guys have probably, you know, you've probably heard me talk about these before. But like in most scouts, okay, there's a lot you can learn from a scout. You can learn how many infirmaries somebody has. And again, the general rule of thumb is just take the number of infirmaries they have times 40,000. So if they've got 5, take 5 times 4. That's an easy number to think about because that's, you know, that's what, 5, 10, 15, 20. That's 20,000, right? So if I do that and add an extra 0, that's essentially 200k that I know of that they can hold. And then you just take that minus whatever the hell they've got in their base, and you know how much dead they're going to get. But, one of the things that you definitely want to consider when you're trying to be a rally lead is both what is your research at? Because most rally leads, okay, are up on the very high end of stats. That means that they more than likely have all of these at 10, are more than likely tier 4, but that doesn't necessarily need to be that way. Because again, if they're not in war gear, odds are that is going to be a huge detrimental effect. And it is key that they stay out of that. If they at any point switch, then it's probably going to hurt. Just saying. Why I say this is because, generally speaking, if a player is online, there's a good chance that they can teleport. They can do a number of things that can just absolutely bog you down. And the only other way to get around it, I will tell you very soon. But having that said, all right, one of the other things that you can do as a rally lead is you need to pay attention to your stats. Now, I was getting into it a little briefly, but again, you guys have probably heard about gear checks. You've probably heard about a bunch of YouTubers just kind of giving you a general line of rule about what gear you need to have. And generally speaking, okay, when it comes to actually being a rally lead, there are kind of like a traffic out. There are like two things that you have to be very mindful of: attack and HP and defense. In the case of a rally lead, you are trying to concern yourself not so much with the attack as much, but more the HP and defense, which is a really weird thing for traps, because trap accounts are generally different in the sense that they want to maximize the amount of attack they can do, but they're not so worried about the losses, which means that they can have an enormous loss count because, you have a 600,000 infirm, and so it's okay to have, 4 to 500,000 in a single hit loss. It's within the realm of, okay. But in the case of a rally lead, you need to reduce that as much as you possibly can. So there are, in fact, some pieces of gear that actually help that out a considerable amount. And that's gear that increases HP. And it really doesn't matter so much what pieces those are, but like some noticeable ones are like the winter mitts. There are also pieces of gear like the burning scrolls that give both HP and attack that are remotely, fairly useful. But there's even, like, in the case of like the blight ring, where you're getting army defense, but also a little bit of, HP as well. And those are the kind of things that you want to consider, because, when you put your gear on, you want to make sure that you're maximizing these particular stats. Now, how do I know if I'm going to do extremely well? Most rally leads in general are going to push a little over 500%, but like some of the best are way over into 600% or higher. And how do they determine that number? Well, they take the 300% of whatever unit type they so choose. So again, the general rule of thumb is that you're usually in 2 unit stats, meaning that you're either range cav or infantry range or some mixture of the two, whatever it might in fact be. And you are going to take that amount and then add what your army attack is. So in my case, it is 191% with 309, meaning that without war gear, without any changes to my war spec, it appears to me that I'm pushing about 491, which is fairly okay when you are going after players. And again, you want to increase that as much as you possibly can. But the other thing that you also have to be incredibly concerned with is the defense and the HP. Now, obviously, you can have in the upwards of almost 375% on the high end as far as HP is concerned. But if you go so high into it that your attack is less than 400 to 500%, you're not going to do very well. Because oftentimes it's not going to pack the punch that you want it to do. And so, generally speaking, I want to say if you're not pushing at least 400%, then you're going to have a hard time. And that's if the person's in war gear. Now, if the person isn't in war gear, that generally won't make much of a difference because you're still going to kill quite a bit. But, when it comes to the gear, one of the things that I would like to point out, though, is that with HP in particular, I would like to think you need to be pushing at least 350%. You can obviously increase this even more because, again, one of the major differences against most players, right? In my case, because I have mostly manners at the moment, my army attack is considerably higher than it usually would be if I had had a bunch of infirmaries. Because this does, in fact, increase your army attack per building. So if I actually kept track of just how many of these manners I have, again, I've got, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 total. I can take 14 times 2, and I know for a fact that I'm getting about 28% extra army attack that I normally wouldn't have. But, again, if you look at like the infirmary, you get 5% for every single infirm. So suppose if I had turned all of these into infirmaries, I would not only have 5% a building, but I would also have to take the total number of buildings, which is, again, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 times 5. That's 50 times 5 again. That'd be 25. So you're looking at almost 75 to 80% HP there. That's a considerable jump. Now, again, there are a lot of things that rally leads do like to consider, which, again, this is where if you're on the higher end, it becomes more important. But army leadership, for example, has a really huge bonus in terms of army advance 2, army health 2, and army defense 2. And also, you can go into the military command branch and go to the very bottom, and you can also grab the tenacious defense with battle fury, because these bonuses as well are also going to have a factor in how well you're going to pack a punch, as well as the hidden talent. Again, there are even things like in VIP that you guys have probably heard about that have a considerable boost as well, almost 10% of a boost. In fact, noticeably, you'll see that, somebody between VIP 15 and VIP 14, most players are only getting 5 and 5, but in this case, you get 10, 10, and 15, right? So you're getting almost 10% across the board, which is a considerable difference. Now, obviously, you are only getting 5% defense and HP, but still, nonetheless, that is going to make a difference if you are being a rally lead. And again, like I said, you don't need to have the most maximized stats imaginable. I would say that the general rule of thumb is that you need to have anywhere from 4 to 500%, and some of the best ones are approximately 600%. And HP can be anywhere from 370-ish or higher. Now, I say 370, but you can manage with only 2 to 300%. It's just that you have to understand that your losses will be considerably higher than usual. Now, granted, if your army attack and your normal base infantry range or whatever 2-unit stats you choose is in the 370-ish range, then you're probably not going to notice it too much. Now, there are things to consider too as well in regard to the actual HP and defense of the individual unit stats. As you can tell, there's actually one of the cool things with the familiar update is that there are actual monsters that are providing army attack boosts, HP to boosts, and defense boosts. And if you haven't noticed, it's actually quite common across all of the familiars to have certain bonuses that they provide, in the case of like Noceros and a few others. And those are things that you want to definitely look out for when you're looking for those little bits of bonuses that might actually give you a bit of an edge. And again, I point these things out because a lot of what you're going to do in terms of bonusing and increasing your rally potential is by bonusing up those stats in particular. But because of the nature of rallies and the way that they are, you can actually get away with a really ridiculous small amount of troops. Because really, all you need is players. And that's the second, like one of the most important bits about being able to do rallies in the first place, because you need people. You need people that have troops and are willing to give them to you so that you can use them to attack targets. And again, I generally like to go after as many players as I possibly can. So if I'm going to go over and I'm going to go to the base, for example, I'm not going to set my all my chips into one player. I'm probably going to have at least anywhere from 10 to maybe 15 players to pick from, so that in case one of them ends up shielding, random teleporting, or whatever, I will always have another target that I have in mind, because I already know what his troop composition is, and I'm already aware of what time of the day he is not online. And again, when it comes to doing rallies, it is incredibly important that you would let your guild know in advance. meaning that maybe mailing your guild and letting them know at a certain time of the day that maybe this is when we will do something, or this is when or how we will do something. I recommend getting Wii Gamers, because that's a really nice way to click on Siren and bring your guild online, as well as even getting into a conference call and actually getting a hold of your guild members and actually having a conversation about when or who you should attack and where. And again, back to like rallies, right? And especially when they're on war gear. Okay, if suppose you're going up against somebody that is, like a billion might, right? A lot of the times, most of us would probably like to think that that is probably a death sentence. That you're unlikely to probably compete with somebody that has an enormous amount of might. One of the few things that oftentimes you need to be very, very mindful of, especially when you're fighting somebody that has an enormous number of troops, is that if you're going to go up against them, I would like to say that, especially a billion might player, is that if they're online and they're in war gear and they're in gold champion gear, and they've got $11,000 hero and that they're maximized completely, that just like somebody that's in war gear, expect losses, especially if they're in war gear and they're online. Because again, those are not the kind of rallies that you will tend to win. Now, you've probably heard of people getting zeroed at a billion might. You might have heard of 500 to 600 mils getting zeroed out. And part of the reason why that is because if they're not in war gear, then they are completely open to getting hit. And again, part of the reason why you would like to consider these kind of things is that if suppose like somebody like Joe is not in war gear, okay, if I hit him the first time around, it probably will hurt. Like, generally, it's the troop composition that's going to hurt the most. But the goal, usually, is to figure out what unit type do they have the least amount of. And then whatever you can do, maximize the possibility of reducing that. So if it's even, you want to use a 2-unit type stat and keep your losses even out across. So give a 40, 20, 40 kind of situation where you put 40% into one unit stat, 20% into the one that you're not using, and 40% in the other unit stat. Send the march, let it land, and of course, when you do send the march, make sure that, and this is something I learned early on, is that you want to make sure that when you do, there are a couple of things you can do to trick your enemy in case they do in fact turn online and go after you. And that you want to basically, I would say, wear gather gear, which is basically gear that's essentially travel speed, and increase your travel speed as much as possible, because when the rally starts, it's going to get that travel speed reduction. The next thing is that basically I would like to recommend having at least 2 sets of war gear. One for the unit set that you want to fool with. So I would say, put on this set of gear and make them think, oh, okay, so this guy is probably going infantry or cavalry, and then instead of going infantry cavalry, switch over to a set that's in complete counter to what you're wearing of what they would like to think would counter it. So if I'm infantry cavalry, they're probably going to assume that they need to go range. That much is a general rule of thumb, because they're going to try to hit the cavalry. And then they're probably going to put cavalry to counter the infantry. So it would be it's more likely that they will go cav phalanx, or they will go range phalanx to counter. And so you want to make sure that when you do this, that at the last moment you switch over to that counter, so that in case they try to counter what you are sending at them, that you at least counter them with the proper set. Now, obviously, this particular mindset is usually not going to do you much good, because again, most players that are experienced will probably look at the troop composition and know right away what you're trying to do. But having that said, there are a few things you can do to at least kind of give them oftentimes, even in the case of forts, that becomes incredibly relevant. It doesn't happen or work so well on players, but it works incredibly well on forts. Because essentially you're giving your enemy the idea that, oh, he's going range, and therefore I must go infantry. And if you switch your gear at the last second, now they think, oh no, I thought he was going range, and now he's going infantry, and I'm sending infantry, and now we're going to tie out. But what if, instead of going infantry and now actually I'm going cavalry? If you completely keep them baffled, they just don't know what to reinforce, and that will oftentimes cause problems. Now, granted, when you are doing forts and you are doing those kinds of things, you just want to be very, very mindful of the fact of who you are up against, what their gear is, and also whether or not they're in a gear that is superior to what you are using. So if they're in gear that is infantry and cavalry, you have most likely better be in gear that is in counter to that, or otherwise you are unlikely to win. Now, the other thing, and this is something else that I would like to point out, is in the case of rallying out players, it is incredibly important that if you do, you want to make sure you get your troop boosts. Now, why I say that is you want to make sure that you have a leader, preferably a level 60 leader, because you'll get a 30% boost, and it helps a considerable amount to have both an altar boost as well, because that's 38% when it's completely maxed out, which is a considerable, that's a lot of travel speed that you're getting, plus HP and attack and defense. That's a lot of bonuses there. But even, getting bonuses in army attack, for example, 50% is a considerable jump. 20% even, granted, it is still a considerable, amount of help. And even increasing your max army size is going to have a factor in how well you are going to perform in that particular attack. And if you want to do as much damage as possible, you want to make sure that you increase that. And especially if that player is not a war gear and it's not online. Those are the kinds of ways where you can get them kind of in a one-hit quitter kind of thing. But having that said, right, and with all of what I've told you, one of the other things that you can do, and this is incredibly common too, is when players are getting reinforced. One of the few problems you're often going to face when trying to rally somebody out is that they're probably going to get reinforcements. Now, one of the few things that I like to do to kind of avoid that is pick out targets that are not in hives. And why I say that is because a lot of the time, players that are not in hives, you can very easily slow their reinforcements down a considerable amount just by being able to basically find a player, surround him. And so by doing that, you're forcing them to have to go anywhere from 10 to 15 seconds longer than normal. But also, what I like to do is, let's suppose I'm going to rally Leo, okay? I'll have one rally on Leo, but I'm also probably going to have a rally on 4 or 5, maybe 6 different players in their guild at the same exact time. The reason why is because I want to make sure that they just don't know who to reinforce. And that works incredibly well, because if you can keep your enemy completely guessing as to whom they need to reinforce, then oftentimes it just doesn't end well for them. And why I do that is because if, let's suppose, I put a rally on Lord and then I put another rally on, say, someone in the same exact guild but somewhere else, having your guild spread out like that is incredibly helpful. And this obviously does require a considerable number of people. And this is why I said that oftentimes when I do these kinds of things, you want to make sure that you've got as many people as you have as possible to do these kinds of things. Because again, if you're going to rally somebody, you kind of need the people to do it. You don't, it really just doesn't work as smoothly. This is why I've been telling you guys that if you have allies, bring them into a line, bring them into Wii Gamers. Come together, bring yourselves onto the same guild. And believe me, you will see some pretty impressive results when you put some of the major forces in all guilds together. They become quite frightening together, in fact. But having that said, what is incredibly useful in those kinds of situations is that by being able to rally one target, you can also go after the reinforcements. Now, this is another strategy that oftentimes you won't see very often in the cases of, little guilds, but you will definitely see it in larger guilds, where suppose if I rally lead, and go after CM Ivan, for example, it's very likely that someone is going to reinforce him. And when they do, someone else is likely to come by and is going to try and hit me, preferably, because they're going to think, well, if I can hit him and stop him from hitting that rally, then I may have a better chance after all. But again, a lot of that, as far as rallying is concerned, You just want to make sure that when you have the people that are reinforcing your rally, you want to make sure that, you know, some of those guys could be Trapagons. You want to make sure that maybe some of those people are garrisoned or reinforced. Because part of the reason why you want to do that is in a situation where someone like that is going to go after the people that are both reinforcing your rally or reinforcing theirs. You want to make sure that you make, you know, them lose as much as he possibly can. Because you want to make sure that that does not end up becoming more costly for your guild in the end. If you can pull that off, then ultimately you're going to have a better chance. Now, in the case of like double rallies or triple rallies, and again, you guys have probably heard of these before, one of the strategies that often works well when actually having to deal with somebody that's online, especially if they're in war gear, is that you want to be able to figure out first, that, you know, if you're going to hit them, you need to know their troop composition, but also, you know, if they're going to flee, have a rally on them. But then simultaneously have someone else start a rally immediately after they have had, you know, one rally go after them. So if one rally is ticking, they can't move. Otherwise, they have to eat the march. So if you get another person to port by and then put a rally on them in another guild, they have no choice but to either eat the rally that they've got coming after them, or they're going to basically get rallied twice. Now, this works incredibly well because essentially you're forcing your opponent to basically get locked, and that oftentimes will, you know, put them in a bit of a panic. Now, granted, you know, if you're not careful, then it can also just as easily end very badly for you, because again, you don't want to spend too long, you know, letting your march completely sent in a distance. Like, oftentimes it'll be very bad for you because they know exactly what the troop composition that you have is coming at them. So you don't have a ton of time to diddle-daddle with that. Like, if you don't get that march almost immediately after that march is landed, there's a very good chance that they could just have the reinforcements sent and have the proper gear and counter the first rally, and then immediately counter the second rally by porting and going away and just rinse repeat. You want to be very, very, very careful of this because it can happen. And again, I point these things out because, again, these are just some things that I've been learning about rallying as of late. If you guys have any suggestions, tips, or anything else that I didn't mention, feel free to say so in the comment section below. But in the meantime, I hope you guys found this video somewhat helpful, and I'll see you guys next time.